not doing anything fancy. Oh, the meeting's being recorded. I think I should leave. Just a quick thing. This is, I guess it's technically the third, but really the second installment in our International Impact series. We've been very fortunate that all of our friends have said yes, even Leonie, who's on today. Everyone has said yes to our ask to just tell us about what's going on in the impact world in their space. We're super excited to have our good friend David Phipps here with us from Research Impact Canada, who has been one of our partners in crime. David himself, but also Research Impact Canada, has been a partner in crime with NABI and now ARIS almost since the beginning. And we're super happy to have Stephen here too with us. And that's all you're gonna get. I'm not gonna sing or dance. I'm gonna turn it over to you guys, and we're looking forward to what you have for us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. Stephen, if you could share the slides. And we'll just start out by I'll introduce myself and then I'll let Stephen introduce himself. My day job is I'm the Assistant Vice President for Research Strategy and Impact at York University in Toronto. And my fun part of the job is being Network Director for Research Impact Canada, and we'll talk a little bit in the presentation about what that is. And my co-presenter is Steve MacGregor.
Thank you. So I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. My research is based out of the RIPPLE program of research, which stands for Research Informing Policy, Practice, and Leadership in Education. And in my PhD research, I'm exploring how knowledge mobilization across Canadian universities takes shape, with a specific focus on co-production and the work of Research Impact Canada.
And Steve's being modest, his PhD is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So he's got external funding for scholarship for his work. Thank you. Steve, the next slide, please.
There we go.
So this is, I have to make everything really small so I can see my slides. So I just wanted to slide on translation because both Americans and Canadians speak English, but we use different words to translate the same thing. So the Advancing Research Impact in Society is a sister network to Research Impact Canada, en français, le Réseau Impact Recherche Canada, because we're in Canada and we're bilingual. But really, when I say the word knowledge mobilization, I want you to hear the words broader impacts or mobilisation des connaissances. Susan or anyone, how do you say broader impacts in Spanish?
No sé.
Yeah, there you go. So not that you're necessarily bilingual with Spanish, but so I just wanted a bit of a slide on translation so that we use different words, but we're actually meaning the same thing. And we'll talk a little bit about how I see lots of similarities between the work of ARIS and the work of, oh, Susan, je ne sais pas. Very good. And the work of Research Impact Canada. Now, this is where Susan might blush because, oh, Steve, next slide, please.
Yeah.
As Susan said, you know, Susan and I go back, way back on this almost from the beginning of NABI, and she's like my impact sister, I would say that. Wouldn't that be true, Susan?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yay. So there's a lot of impact love going on between Canada and the US and between Susan and David. And thank you. You love the haircut. We'll talk about my hair later, Megan. So just that this, there's a lot that we have learned in Canada from working with ARIS, previously NABI, and similarly a lot that we've done together. And we'll talk about some of that again towards the end of the slide deck, because one of the things we're going to end with is my prediction that I think we're increasingly going to see this work be internationalized. And Susan and NABI are a driving force. You've got for this internationalization, Susan, because you've got an international advisory committee. Is that right? Advisory board? Perfect. So Steve, the next slide, please. So this is what we're going to talk about Research Impact Canada, some background informing our work, and then the future of knowledge mobilization, talking about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And I should say this presentation comes from a paper that we were funded to do. The Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which, as its name implies, funds the social sciences and humanities, reached out to Research Impact Canada and said, we'd like a paper on the futures of knowledge mobilization. And so Steve has been working with us for, Steve, I'm going to say about 2 years now. Is that right? And because of Steve's expertise in looking at the academic research on knowledge mobilization with his supervisor, who's Amanda Cooper in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University in Kingston, we've working with Steve, and he's done a lot of the evaluation work for Research Impact Canada, and so he was a natural to bring on to develop some of these concepts with us. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that covers everything I would have said at that slide.
Excellent, thank you. So Steve, the next slide, please. So what is Research Impact Canada? We're quite different from ARIS. We are a network. We have only 20 members, 19 Canadian members and 1 British member, whereas I believe ARIS is most of the members are individuals as well as some institutions. So our focus is on the institution. Our focus is to build the institutional capacity to support knowledge mobilization or broader impacts. And so we work together as a community of practice, sharing all of these practices, these policies. You know, it can be something, who's got a job description for someone that looks like this? Does anyone have a good plan for undergraduate experiential education, for example? And different, I would say about half of the universities in this network have the effort focused in their Office of Research or Research Services, depending how you call it. And a big focus of those folks is supporting these impact strategies and grant applications. But others do other work such as engagement, public engagement. We've got some research communicators. We've got some librarians in our network. So it's a wonderful diversity of folks who are all working on connecting science to society in different ways, but we really look to try and forge create the conditions where impact can occur. And by impacts, what we want to do is go beyond engagement. We want to go beyond dissemination. We actually want to create the conditions where we can see policy changes because of research. We can see new products coming to market, or we can see new social services being delivered by community or nonprofit or civil society organizations. So we are across Canada. We don't have any representation in the north. The only province in Canada where we are not represented is Prince Edward Island, and they have 1 university, so resistance is futile. At some point, PEI will come on board. What is common amongst all of us is the work we do to support engagement, dissemination, events, and grant support. But we really come together under shared qualities of reciprocity, meaningful partnerships, trust between academic and non-academic partners, sharing and multiplier effects where one person at a university can actually consume the Research Impact Canada content and make that accessible to many, many, many people at her university. And we've got both central coordination, as I talked about in the research office, but also examples where it's happening more locally in different departments or units. So Steve, the next slide is yours.
Yes. So as David mentioned, we're going to start with just a bit of background about the ongoing evaluation of Research Impact Canada's work, which really informed our thinking in that paper for SSHRC, which is the abbreviation for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So in late 2017, Research Impact Canada had a strong strategic plan, a clear mission, mandate, and vision. And yet at the time, it had not developed a framework to evaluate its outcomes and contributions to downstream impacts. In early 2018, so a little over a year, or a little less than a year later, the evaluation committee, together with an external evaluator, developed a logic model, an evaluation framework that mapped Research Impact Canada's target audiences, common activities, enabling conditions, and what success would look like. So providing a sort of measurement overview. And following the development of these evaluation tools, David and I, along with the evaluation committee, co-produced a detailed evaluation plan for collecting data from Research Impact Canada member institutions about the activities the network was using to build K&B capacity. And ultimately, we settled on what they found useful and what contributed to use in their professional practice. So those were the 2 key concepts, usefulness and use. The plan was designed as 2 phases. So the first is presented here on this slide, and we examined the usefulness aspect of the evaluation through a survey, which provided a high-level overview of network activities. So outlined in this slide, we provide some of the answers that we noticed to questions that came to us as key focal points for beginning the evaluation. So we posed questions such as, what did members want most? We see that they wanted sharing, the use and evaluation of K&B tools, resources, and best practices. Some members talked about this idea of practice-based subgroups. So people who were doing research communication wanted to know what others who were doing research communication were doing. We asked what predicted positive outcomes. We saw that for most members, they reported that it was time with the network, it was time in their current institutional role, and the degree to which Knowledge Broker described their institutional role. We asked, how can we understand the cost benefit of involvement? And members talked about how benefits exceeded costs, but that active engagement was key. This idea of you get out what you put in. And then we also asked, what challenges are current members dealing with involvement? And primarily those were around institutional limitations like time and turnover. And from this basis, which was marked by a number of feedback loops between David and I with the evaluation committee and the broader membership, we transitioned in the beginning of this year, or well, end of last year, beginning of this year, to phase 2, which involves semi-structured interviews with key informants from 16 of Research Impact Canada's 20 member institutions. It's actually 17 at the time that we began. And the focus in phase 2 was on exploring phase 1 topics in greater detail. So some of those ones that we just mentioned, but also exploring that use aspect. So what was actually contributing to their K&B practice. And so we're still in the reporting stage of phase 2, but we have identified a number of emerging themes. The first deals with this idea of centralized versus decentralized knowledge mobilization. So that's some of the things that David had actually talked about a little bit earlier. There were some people are operating from a central office and others are operating in a more dispersed across an institution fashion. And so we see one member talking about how one of the issues that comes up is that many people are doing this work across the university. So it's hard to know who's doing what, working with whom, making sure that we're not having overlap or we're not asking the same people to do things. And similarly, following on from that, members talked about recognizing the value of that they're not alone in doing this work. So it's this idea of sharing the challenges. And so some of the things that members talked about were very open about sharing not just the resources and the experiences, but even the negative stories when something didn't work. And I think that's really important. Somebody else talked about how we hear each other. We hear the problems that others have, and we realize that we're not alone, that they have the same problems in some cases as we do. And two additional areas that we're going to highlight here that David and I thought would be interesting for the ARIS membership are the benefits that Research Impact Canada members are realizing through their involvement with the network, along with the recommendations that they provided for getting the most out of network learning. So starting with benefits, the first, which perhaps unsurprisingly, was that members spoke about how the network contributed to advanced knowledge and understanding of knowledge mobilization. Another benefit was feeling equipped to move beyond the traditional push paradigm of knowledge mobilization. So the idea of, for example, sending a press release and hoping for a bite. One member talked about how they are increasingly feeling equipped to do this work. Oh, I just got, sorry.
Mary Beth will take care of that.
So one member talked about how they feel increasingly equipped to make sure that we are creating things that speak to the people that we're trying to reach. And then a third benefit that really stuck out was how the network opened the doors for cross-institution collaboration. And that was both within Canada, so researchers working together, and beyond Canada and partnering with networks like ARIS. And at the same time, Research Impact Canada members were talking about how these benefits were really driven by a few key recommendations that they had for getting the most out of the network. So first on their list was to cultivate an awareness for the broader social cultural context for knowledge mobilization. And that meant a particular emphasis on the local before going broader to regional and national. Second was to develop an awareness for the personal knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are required for this sort of work. And that looked like developing sort of a metacognitive awareness that was a crucial first step to knowing how to leverage that capital that exists in the network. And building on that, members also talked about how realizing the greatest benefit from the network happened when they were actively and purposely engaged. Simply being connected to others doesn't in and of itself confer value. And with that, David and I, just to say before we move on, that we'd be happy to, I think you'd agree, David, share the findings report once it's ready.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. In fact, Steve, what I've done while you were talking is we have published an article on the phase 1 of the evaluation. So I put that link in the chat, and we'd be more than happy to share the phase 2. And when it's been reviewed and accepted by our governance committee, we'd be happy to share that. And one of the advantages of working with an academic like Steve is he actually wants to write in peer-reviewed publications. And so Steve and I are enjoying writing this up together. So thank you for that, Steve. Just before we move on, I just want to just emphasize that the evaluation that has informed that Steve has talked about it's evaluating the actions of the network. What we don't do is evaluate one knowledge mobilization university against another university. So we're very clear that we don't do a comparison of knowledge mobilization of Research Impact Canada members, but we are working the evaluation is on the actions of our network. And Susan, a note that I made on something a number of months ago, might have been in the summit, is I think you've got who you call the Erins, two women named Erin that are the Ellens. We might want to connect, have a conversation with the Ellens and Stephen and myself, just around evaluation of networks, because I think that would be really cool.
All right, I'll let you take it from there.
Great, thank you. So where have we been? I must say that, when we start looking at the timeline of these efforts around broader impacts or knowledge mobilization, I think the US really kicked a lot of it off with the land grant universities, the Land Grant Act of 1892, where, I don't need to tell you this, but Canadians don't know this history, that state money went into state institutions in order to create benefits to state actors such as farmers and the agricultural industry. So, it's nice that I think we've been doing this since 2006, but, it pales in comparison to what some of the experiences that are in the States. But in Canada, we really kicked off some of this with the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, which was one of the federal government's, well, in my opinion, the first federal investment in what we call knowledge mobilization. And this was set up in the late 1990s, and it was set up explicitly to invest in health services research that partnered health services researchers with health services practitioners. So policymakers, nurses, public health units, epidemiology, like all the public health stuff that's going on today. So that was the first really federal investment in, and at that time they called it knowledge transfer and exchange. And then in the early 2000s, our main funders, most of our main federal funders of research hopped on board. SSHRC, or the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, uses the word knowledge mobilization, and they came on in about 2009 with an explicit knowledge mobilization mandate, where every application, as NSF has to have a broader impact strategy, every SSHRC application has to have a knowledge mobilization strategy. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research came out in 2000. The year 2000 with a knowledge translation strategy. And then the Federal Network of Centers of Excellence program was really focused on investing in research to create an explicit socioeconomic impact. And this program, which has been going since the mid-90s, has just sunsetted the last, these are very large networks, so funding about $5 million a year for 5 years, up to 15 years of funding, and in areas of strategic social, economic, and health and environmental issues for Canada. The program's just been sunsetted, but it's been replaced with the final one on the right, the New Frontiers in Research Fund, and this is similar size, $24 million over 6 years, but that it invests in research and training expressly to address a socioeconomic priority for Canada. Canada doesn't tell us the priorities. They want these applications to build in, to make the social and economic case for investment in the research. And what's really interesting is SSHRC and CIHR and the NCE program required you to write a research proposal and then an impact strategy. And what the new frontiers is, there's no impact strategy. There's no separate space for researchers to say, and this is how we'll do impact. That means you've got to weave the impact strategy into the research proposal. And that to me is, I think, a very sort of next level of maturity so that we're not thinking of research and impact separately, but we're actually, our researchers are having to think of impact at the same time as they think of the research. And so I think it's an interesting evolution of the role that impact is playing in grant funding programs in Canada. So that's one example of where we have been. I'm also, let me just say, feel free to interrupt us. You can put a comment in the chat, and Mary Beth, if you could monitor the chat, or just feel free to bellow, and we will be happy to take comments either during or at the end. And so on the next slide, Steve. And this is a framework how I think about impact, is we call this impact literacy. And impact literacy is the center of this Venn diagram, that if we understand how to create impact, we understand what impact has occurred, and we can evaluate and measure and collect the evidence of that impact. And we understand the skills that we need to create this. The intersection of those three is what I call impact literacy. And it's interesting to look around the world, and there's a couple of different paradigms. And I would say in Canada that Research Impact Canada and ARIS are focused on creating these impacts, but also focused on the skills and that's a new thing for us. But really, our history is coming out of how do we create impacts. We're now starting to look at the skills of these impacts. But in places like Australia, the UK, and New Zealand with the Tertiary Education Commission, they have assessment exercises where all universities and therefore all researchers are assessed on how their research is not only excellent in creating scholarly impact, but also creating impact beyond the university. And so I talk about Canada and the US as being a mission-driven system. We're driven by, because we as individual researchers, as impact practitioners and as institutions, we do it because it's the right thing for us to do. Whereas in Australia, the UK, and New Zealand, and others now, they're assessment driven. They also care about how and who, but they're really, the institutions especially are driven by these assessments, because in the UK, with the Research Excellence Framework, your success in the Research Excellence Framework drives your size of your university operating grant from the government. And so there's 2 billion British pounds, billion with a B, British pounds, that are driven to funding universities based on their excellence. And in the Netherlands, thank you, Leonie, I believe that's the standard evaluation protocol that the Netherlands has. And so Steve, in the next slide, please. So, and what we've, my colleague Julie Bailey and my colleague Julie Bailey from the University of Lincoln in the UK and I came up with this concept of impact literacy, and our focus was on the individual. And that's where our focus of a lot of this work is: how do we build capacity of the individuals? That could be researchers, could be students, it could be community partners. But one thing that we are quite interested in is how do we grow from the individual to the institutional capacity? And this is still where have we been, because we've written this up about 3 years ago, and we've used it to build some tools that I'll show you in a minute. But our first paper had the who, what, and how in the middle. As you can see, the inside ring, the turquoise ring, is about the individuals. And then the outside ring is what are the opportunities for institutions? So how, on the left-hand side, how can an institution help a researcher find a partner? How can the institution recognize and value the engagement activities of our researchers? How can an institution provide communication support, for example? So we'll unpack some of these. So our focus has grown. We still are very interested in the role of building capacity at the individual level, but we're increasingly focused on the institutional level, and that's the lens for Research Impact Canada. Steve, I'll turn it over to you. And you are muted.
Thank you, David, for stopping me before I got too far. So we're turning now from where we've been to where we are now. And this is really with an eye to those past developments around knowledge mobilization and impact. When we think about research institutions, we see they're increasingly immersed in and also grappling with the circumstances of the impact agenda, as it's come to be known. And so there exists a need for more capacity in knowledge mobilization, be that tools or financial resources or some other elements as outlined in that model shown on the last page. And it's across what Bev Holmes and Alan Best termed the 3 generations models of knowledge mobilization, which are roughly depicted in this figure from Louis Shaxson and colleagues. And it represents sort of the spectrum of knowledge mobilization. And the development of these models has progressed over time to address earlier theoretical limitations, as well as limitations related to the types of knowledge represented in knowledge mobilization. So today we see that these models coexist in practice. We saw that, and we're seeing that in the Research Impact Canada evaluation in members' practice. And that really just so that they're coexisting within institutions across roles and across units. And that said, the 3 generations framing, it's actually really, even though these things may be coexisting, it's accurate, especially in the sense that activities towards the left-hand side of the spectrum have received the greatest attention in scholarship and practice. So in considering where the research today is most needed, and also where the focus is most transitioning, it's towards the right-hand side of the spectrum, towards systems models, even on from relational models of knowledge mobilization. And so when we consider how we represent and study knowledge mobilization, we face what Alison Powell and colleagues phrased as an ironic situation. And this is an important quote, so I'll read it aloud, which states that we're facing this ironic situation that the field of knowledge mobilization practice seems somewhat detached from its own knowledge base, with knowledge mobilization activities often being developed and carried out without reference to existing theory or to practical experience, and without robust evaluations that can contribute to the knowledge base for the future. So we're left to ask, rather than research institutions seeking to bridge the gap, which is this sort of left-hand figure here, between theory and practice, which again reaffirms this idea of siloed groups that we're trying to get away from, how can they facilitate closing the loop? And as many disciplines are now appreciating, part of that solution is really requiring an understanding of problems of practice and listening to practitioners about the institutional structures that they're dealing with that support and constrain their knowledge mobilization work. And as a starting point with that, we consider in the paper for Shirk this idea of structural accretion, which suggests that as institutions expand their functions, often without forgoing old ones, it can be difficult to see how new ways of working fit alongside or replace existing structures. And so we turn to some of the recent work by Christopher Satanovic and colleagues, we can provide the link for that, who identified these 7 themes that relate to the features of research organizations that aim to enhance impact of science on policy and practice. So they offer recommendations at the organizational level, the individual level, financial level, material level, practical level, political level, and social level. And these themes offer some of, from our review of the literature, first empirically grounded guidance for research institutions that are seeking to develop and implement new approaches to K&B. At the same time, we've noted how this model speaks minimally to the ways that these elements interact and work together towards similar aims, and that recommendations presented in the model are based on a single case study and of a relatively recent research project. And so much as we sort of are seeing in many areas of K&B scholarship, much work remains to be done. And so we have turned in, as we look towards the future, we turn to some of the recent work around impact literacy.
Great, thank you. Steve. So Steve has presented some of the scholarship that we've turned to, and we want to be able to close the loop, not just bridge the gap of scholarship to practice. And so this is why the Steve and David collaboration is really satisfying, as is the Julie and David, because I'm the practitioner of the partnership, and it's a pleasure to work with scholars. And so where are we now? Bill, we have taken the impact literacy. Remember the Venn diagram of the who, what, and how? We have combined those together, still representing who, what, and how in a pyramid, but we've added some elements specifically that individuals on the right-hand side and organizations or institutions on the left can each have increasing understandings of impact literacy, where an institution can be supportive, or it can actually enable it, or can actually drive it. And where individuals are aware there is evidence, they might be engaged with that evidence, or they're critical of the evidence and they're part of the creation of the evidence. We recognize on the bottom left and right that we can build service capacity institutions and build personal capacity in practitioners and researchers and partners. But then I think one thing we don't talk about, and it's something that is, I think, woefully underdeveloped in both practice and in the literature, is why we do this. What are the ethics? We always talk about impacts as a positive thing. Well, what about the negative impacts of research, especially on the negative impacts that we have with historical research with Indigenous communities, right? So why do we do this? What are the values? What are the ethics? Are you in, and Grimpacts, thank you, Leonie. There's a publication, it was a report that was posted, really a discussion paper about the grim impacts, things like anti-vaxxers basing their ideas on published literature. And so I think this area, the why, is an underdeveloped space and something that I'm open to developing. Julie, the link on this slide is the publication that Julie and I have published on this. And this impact literacy really underscores 5 elements that has, on the next slide, Steve, have turned into an institutional health check. And this is really focusing at the level of the institution. This is a tool available at that website published by Emerald Publishing in the UK. And it's a self-assessment that allows an institution to be able to say, what is our level of commitment to impact? What is our level of connectivity? That means the different roles within the university. How are we connected? How does the institution support the co-production of research? How does the institution support competencies and capacity building? And then clarity, how does the institution communicate all of this? And so there are 5 elements in this health check workbook. If you're interested, Susan, I'd be happy to come back and do a webinar on how to use this health check to be able to assess. It might be your whole institution as a university. It might be your research unit, right? And depending on the flexibility you have to create policies and services. But this is not used at the individual level. It's more used at the unit or institutional level. And so again, built on the impact literacy frameworks. And Steve, if I could pass the next one to you.
Yeah, so one last point that we touched on in our work before moving on to what we're seeing in the future of knowledge mobilization and impact is around this idea of, well, actually, I think really we'll set it off with this quote from Hugh Davies and Sandra Nutley, which reads that impact is always uncertain, iterative, contingent, and highly social. And so as the boundaries have started to blur between what David earlier mentioned as mission-driven and assessment-driven impact systems, we see this uptick in interest around how to assess the impacts of K&B, including interest from institutions, such as through things like that institutional health check. And this figure from a recent paper by David Buds Peterson and colleagues provides a snapshot of the international activity around impact assessment and the wide variety of methods being used, which can sort of induce this sense of uncertainty about what is working. And indeed, they allude to that in their paper. In our work, we found it important to caution that as institutions become more involved in impact measurement, they'll need to be mindful of an over-reliance on what several people in the literature now said is counting what can be easily measured rather than measuring what counts in terms of significant and enduring changes. So with that, I'll pass it back to David.
Okay, so this is where we think we're going in Canada, and it'll be interesting to hear your reflections if any of this resonates with where you are in the States. Where we are in Canada is that there's a lot of focus in the literature on the left-hand side, which is national or provincial policies that are driving impact in research. And there's a big focus in the literature and in the practice side on the researcher and the partner relationship. There's relatively little on the institution, there's little effort apart from Research Impact Canada. And there's a little examination on the institution, except for some of the stuff that's coming out of the Ripple program that Steve and his supervisor Amanda are looking at. So I think in the future, we're going to see a lot more focus on the institution. We increasingly in Canada, we are seeing universities come out with some form of engagement or impact as an institutional priority. At York, we call it a university academic plan, where we very much want to do excellent world-leading research, but we also fundamental research even, but we also want to do research that has an impact on our local and our global communities. So I think increasingly we're going to see that impact is a core component of the research enterprise, even in a mission-driven system like Canada. Next slide, Steve. And I think this should be not where are we now, but where are we going? We talked a little bit about we're going to get away from these pillars of theory and practice and see much more the closing the loop between theory and practice. And I think the work that we're doing between Ripple at Queen's, and Queen's University is not a member of Research Impact Canada, but between the Ripple program at Queen's and Research Impact Canada. And I think this is with Ripple being academic researchers and Research Impact Canada being primarily non-academic practitioners of impact. And I think this collaboration increasingly we'll see in the future more of this work going on. And the next slide, Steve. And increasingly, there's a lot of focus on the individual at the project level. I think increasingly we're going to see, and we're going to be building institutional capacity for impact literacy. This slide is I was in Melbourne at the end of February, and I got out. I didn't get out just in time, but I got home just before, about 2 weeks before everything shut down. And I did a seminar, and I put up an ask to, there were about 100 and some people in the audience, what do you need now? And what the people voted on was, out by a long shot, was we need staff supports for impact. So what is being asked for, and that audience was a mixture of academics, of impact practitioners, staff, and students, and increasing, they all said they wanted professional supports at their universities, which is kind of like the model that Research Impact Canada is promoting. And I'll invite ARIS to comment, but my understanding is that NABI, while focused, that in the NABI days, there were a lot of individual practitioners and researchers that increasingly, I'm hoping that ARIS is seeing some institutions that are, and BI offices that are growing in the States. Next slide, Steve. So where are we going? The internationalization of impact. I think increasingly we're going to see what ARIS and what Research Impact Canada are doing is we're sharing across borders. The Times Higher Ed, which actually just today released the Times Higher Ed rankings for not their impact rankings, but their overall rankings of universities. Last year was the second year in a row that they did the impact rankings, and they're working with Vertical Ventures, a UK company. And this is ranking institutions on their ability to talk about the impact that their university, not just their research, but the university has had on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, these 17 SDGs under that. And so we're, as impact drives rankings, universities who love to hate but love rankings will increasingly need to be investing in impact if they want to be seen to be scoring higher on these rankings. And ARIS and Research Impact Canada, I said, is a great international collaboration. And we've done a piece of work over the last 2 years under the auspices of INORMS, which is the International Network of Research Management Societies. And that is things like the Society for Research Impact International in the States is for research administrators. The Canadian Association of Research Administrators, or NCURA is the network of I actually have no idea what NCURA stands for, but University Research Administration is the URA of NCURA. And so under INORMS, we had a working group that had Susan was on it. We had Esther de Smet from Flanders in Belgium who was on that, someone from the UK, and we had someone from Australia, New Zealand, Ghana, and Japan. Together they provided oversight to some work that ARIS and Research Impact Canada recently did, which was work together on a toolkit for research impact and stakeholder engagement. That soft launched in May of this year, and it's up on the Research Impact Canada website, so I'll share the link when I stop talking. And it's just a soft launch because we have to get it translated en français to be able to do a hard launch in Canada. Steve, the next slide, please. And this is the thing that I think we're increasingly going to see about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is happening as a global phenomenon right now. This cartoon really shows that on the left-hand side, if we practice equality, everyone gets the same size box. If we practice equity, you get a box that helps you elevate to the same level as everyone else. Or if you move the fence and make it a chain link fence, you have removed the structure. You have removed systemic barriers. Right, and so you don't even need equity and equality, just remove those systemic barriers to allow everyone to have equal access. So with this idea of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, we're starting now to add a new I on the end, which is, new D, which is decolonization. So we're starting now to think about this playing out at two levels. How do we ensure that the operations of Research Impact Canada are actively considering EDI, but also how is EDI going to drive our strategy? And I think we're okay on the first one and we can understand that, but it's really an interesting question to say, what is the role of Research Impact Canada in helping Canadians create an equitable, diverse, and inclusive research environment in the country? And and in Canada, we have a focus on women, on disabilities, on Indigenous people, racialized individuals, and LGBTQ+. So Steve, I think the next slide is yours.
Yes. So in that recent work that we did with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, we ended our paper with a suggestion of next steps, which really followed not only out of our work, but out of a panel that we held with some rich discussion with 17 impact and knowledge mobilization practitioners and scholars from Canada, the UK, and Europe. And we arrived at these three sort of overarching recommendations, things that we saw as particularly important for bolstering our efforts around knowledge mobilization in Canada. So the first was establishing targeted funding to support the development of KMB capacity across Canada. And we were seeing eligible activities under such a fund as including things like the hiring and training of impact practitioners, cost of open access publishing, dissemination of scholarship in non-traditional formats, and things like engagement of researchers and students with research partners. The second was we saw a need for recognizing knowledge mobilization in tenure and promotion. At the same time, recognizing that the call for KMB to be recognized in tenure and promotion must ultimately be driven by faculty and students. And so there are some exemplars for universities to follow, especially those in Canada, such as the University of Brighton, which is a member of the Research Impact Canada Network, which has established standards of excellence for professors from entry level to chair along 4 criteria. So academic leadership, research, enterprise, and education. And enterprise specifically embraces activities and accomplishments that would contribute to socioeconomic impacts. And then the third that we suggested was the need to support the development and implementation of knowledge mobilization strategies in grant applications. So having funded the development of institutional impact literacy and made it part of researchers' assessments, so that's recommendations 1 and 2, research granting agencies we see can close the loop for the research enterprise by requiring institutions to support the development and implementation of KMB strategies in grant applications.
Thanks, Steve. This is the last slide. I just want to say that it is not enough for agencies to call for knowledge mobilization or broader impact strategies. They've got to be adequately assessed. And the assessment, so that means training peer reviewers who are scientists who not only be able to assess the science, but also be able to adequately assess the broader impacts of the knowledge mobilization strategies in these grant applications. And that's the piece that we are working on with Emerald Publishing in the UK. And this final slide is just an example of where Canada, the federal government, has invested in a program called the Future Skills Centre. And that is Research Impact Canada is the knowledge mobilization partner in the Future Skills Centre. And this is a $363 million 5-year program to build future skills in Canada, with 50% of the effort being focused on marginalized populations, including youth, seniors, and immigrants, new Canadians, and also Indigenous communities. And so we are the knowledge mobilization partner in this, and it's just a signal that Canada is thinking, while not yet fully into the academic research space, is is nonetheless thinking that knowledge mobilization is a key part of federal programming as we move forward. So that's really where we think the future of knowledge mobilization will be. And so if Steve, you could stop sharing the slides, and we will now turn it over to some questions and comments. Mary Beth, are there any questions that have been posted in the chat? I know I see a number of things are there. I just haven't been following. No, nothing, no questions. So yes, you've got a question on, yes, absolutely, Tad.
Hi, thanks very much. And really great to hear the talk. I think really provocative in a lot of ways. And a lot of things come to mind, but I will limit myself to one question. I should say as well that I'm based in England, London, England. I work at University College London in the Bartlett faculty for the built environment, and I'm the impact manager there. So coming from a slightly different perspective. But around kind of theory and practice and closing that loop, I think it's a really interesting paradigm that you're talking about there. And I wonder if there's something about changing how we think about the roles of practitioners and how we define them, and this space of kind of academics and non-academics. And that, you know, I find so much as an impact practitioner that I read a lot, you know, I do some of my own research, and I find myself kind of surrounded by a lot of that information. And there's something kind of ethical, I think, as well, about disrupting a little bit this idea that there are academics and there are not academics. And so in the training that we're trying to do within our faculty and with our other impact practitioners, we're trying to encourage that kind of critical sense of understanding what impact is and reading widely. So I do wonder sometimes if this is kind of the thin end of the wedge for kind of disrupting a little bit those maybe hierarchies that have come up around academics and non-academics. But I'd be very curious to know what you think.
Right. Could I just do a shout out to University College London? You said you're at UCL?
Yes, that's right.
I just saw yesterday UCL's leading a £4 million national collaboration to drive academic policy engagement. Have you seen that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic project.
Very, very exciting. I might email you and get some more input.
You can definitely have a chat, sure.
Thank you. So about disrupting power structures. Is that so? Yeah. Sandra Nutley recently retired as the academic director from the Research Unit for Research Utilization, or RURU. It's a research unit at St Andrews in Scotland that studies how research gets used. And so, if you're interested, ruru.ac.uk is their website. She's written a lot on power, and that we really need to think about power when we do this work. And one of the things that I like to say, even though I'm at an academic institution, is we're lousy at sharing power. We're really good at holding it, and really lousy at creating equity between academic and non-academic partners. I'll just share one example from my own personal experience about how we've tried to do this. So when we write a grant application to fund a knowledge mobilization project, that would be me writes that application. I always have a non-academic co-PI on that application. That means I have to do their CV because they don't have a CV. It means I have to write the pieces for them so that they can review them. So it's extra work, but what it allows me to do as the co-PI is I can now transfer funds to them, right? And so there's this false understanding that we can't transfer funding to our community partners. Well, you actually can. You just have to set up the grant in the right way. So we got $132,000 to do some work on precarious housing with our local United Way organization, which for you in the UK, you don't have United Ways, but it's like an umbrella nonprofit funder. And I sent $93,000 of that to the United Way so they could hire the broker working in the community, as opposed to hiring the university person to work in the university and tell community what to do. So that would be a way that we were disrupting the traditional power hierarchies. But if anyone else has some examples that they could share, I think, how do you pronounce your name, by the way?
It's Tig, so a bit like tiger, but without the bit at the end.
Excellent. So if you've got anything, if anyone's got some other examples for Tig and myself, that would be great. Steve, did you have anything about disrupting power structures?
Well, I guess the only thing that did come to mind that I was going to mention was I just wanted to give a shout out to Memorial University, particularly the Harris Center in Canada, because they're doing some really fascinating things around dismantling or disrupting power structures. and in particular around doing knowledge mobilization, doing things in knowledge mobilization with room for them to fail. So they have that freedom to try things and for them not to work out, particularly in working with non-academic audiences. And really that's gone a long way through my conversations with the people working there in setting up more willingness to engage outside the university, because it doesn't always have to result in academic publications or other traditional measures of success.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
David, this is Kevin Nemi from the ARIS leadership and University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have a great history of engagement through our Wisconsin IDEA, but one of the parts of campus we struggle with engaging them in our engagement efforts is the med school. How have you and Canada kind of merged the two basic applied research communities with the med school community? We have the translational research activities, which I think is their attempt to be more engaged with the community, but can you comment on that from a Canadian perspective?
Okay, I can. I'll tell one thing that is a driver of success and one thing that is an absolute abomination, in my opinion. This is being recorded. I have to remember that. So the Canadian Institutes of Health Research is the funder, the primary funder of all health and medical research in Canada, and every CIHR grant has to have a knowledge translation strategy. And I think that was a primary, the predecessor to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research was the Medical Research Council, and that was funding basic science and basic medical science. Into the year 2000, that changed to the CIHR, where everything also had to have a translation component. It hasn't, what that has done was create the conversation and started some culture change. And so now we're doing, we're not so much brokering between basic fundamental sciences and medical sciences, but the medical folks are now more actively pursuing knowledge translation. That has ended up a number of years ago into the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, or SPOR, or SPORS, with funding for units across in all provinces in Canada to help medical researchers engage patients in authentic ways in their research. And some places it's ended up being a glorified knowledge translation support unit, which is great. But in Ontario, it's just been funding academics. It's been funding no patient agencies. It's been funding no health advocacy agencies. And I was asked to chair their Knowledge Mobilization Committee in Ontario. And I said, great, who's my patient co-chair? And they said, what? Like, how can you do patient-oriented research and not actually have patients at the center of everything? So I think what Canada has done, what CIHR has done is great in creating the conversation, but we've still, but they're doing it almost exclusively by funding the academic side. Oh, Tig, how to disrupt. This is what I said to Australia recently. They had me looking at a review of their big research centers. And I said, why don't you stop funding academics and start funding community people? Why don't you start funding health units that can then partner back to community, to universities, instead of funding universities that want to partner out? And this is the Clarks, the, Tig, do you know what the Clarks are? It's in England.
I'm aware of them. Yeah,
I just can't remember. They're big buckets of money that funded expressly to do health services work, and they funded universities. And 10 years after, millions and millions and millions of pounds, what they found is, oh, we collaborate more. Zero outpatient outcomes. Right, so so I do think there's Kevin, I went off a tangent from your question, but I do think a way of disrupting is to fund those people who are making the products, industry, developing the policies, governments, or delivering the social services, community organizations, fund them to then partner back to the university.
I'll dovetail on that and say that our School of Education, which is routinely rated #1 for research in the United States, has set up an office called the Network. And what they do is collect community partners who want assistance with research. And then that network finds the researchers who will do it with them. So it's the same, what you just said is what our School of Education, which in my opinion had a horrible community connection for decades, because it was all about getting research grants to study education, not to impact education.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Susan or Mary Beth, we've got a couple minutes left. What would you like to do with our time?
I figure if there's more questions, let's ask them. If there's not, I'll give you guys a chance to have your last comments.
Thank you, Jean, for putting a note in about the ARIS community. In fact, Jean and I have been exchanging on the ARIS community platform. So thank you, Jean. Steve, last words of wisdom.
Words of wisdom. Well, I would say that the thing that I've found the most benefit in this space is just partnering with Research Impact Canada and learning from the people who are doing this work. And I'm just so excited and grateful for the opportunity to present for the people in ARIS. And I'd love to connect in the future to talk more about impact or knowledge mobilization or opportunities to collaborate on something. Yeah, I'll just say that.
Excellent. And let me just pulse check with Susan. Am I right in believing that universities in the States might be building BI offices?
There are some that are working on it. We have our new institutional pilot program.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really excited about that. But yes, more and more.
I do sing the praises of the Missouri Connector, by the way.
You just want another t-shirt.
Oh yeah, I do. I wanted that and one of what Megan's wearing. Well, then let me, on behalf of Stephen, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been great. I've got a few new connections, and Tig, I'm sure I'll find your email online. And
I'll drop you a line. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you.
Susan. Thanks, Mary
David.
Beth. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
for being here.
Bye-bye.